Everyone treats summer like it owes you happiness. Long days, pool parties, your best life on a loop. So what does it mean when you feel worse? The summer blues are real. It's why summer is one of the busiest stretches of the year for people starting therapy. Therapy is not only for when you're in crisis. Growth therapy is for all the moments when you decide you want more support, more clarity, more tools. Mental health isn't a destination you reach. It's something you build, and Grow makes that easier. Grow connects you with thousands of high-quality licensed therapists across the U.S., offering both virtual and in-person sessions, nights and weekends. You can search by what matters, like insurance, specialty, identity, or availability, and get started in as little as 2 days. There are no subscriptions, no long-term commitments. You just pay per session. Grow helps you find therapy on your time. The therapist you want takes your insurance on Grow. Grow accepts over 125 insurance plans. Sessions average $21 with insurance, and some pay as little as $0 depending on their plan. Visit growtherapy.com/booknow today to get started. That's growtherapy.com/booknow. growtherapy.com/booknow. Availability and coverage vary by state and insurance plan.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You're listening to the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. Join me as we uncover the rich histories of North America's Great Plains, exploring the latest archaeological discoveries and past cultures that shape this storied region. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to episode 47 of the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. I am your host, Professor Carlton Shield-Chief-Gover, and I am thrilled to have you join me on this exciting journey through the rich and fascinating histories of North America's Great Plains. Tonight, I am joined by Dr. Magdalena Lewandowska, who recently graduated from the New World Archaeology Department at how do I pronounce that university name? Jagiellonian, thank you so much, University in Krakow, Poland. Her current work focuses on cross-cultural exchange in the North American Southwest between Southern Ascobadan speakers, Southern Numic speakers, and the Pueblos. In 2019, she published an article on the topic of Athabascan migration to the North American Plains Anthropologist, Southwest, and contributions in New World Archaeology Journal. She's interested in migration studies, intercultural exchange, and the hunter-gatherer cultures of the Southwest. Dr. Lewandowska, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. How are you doing?
Thank you for having me on the podcast. I'm doing very well. Thank you so much.
Excellent. So we are continuing this recent series of featuring current articles in Plains Anthropologist, the quarterly journal by the Plains Anthropological Society. And so tonight we're talking with Magdalena about their recent article titled Trade, Conflict, and Alliance, Relationship Between the Southern Plains and the Rio Grande Pueblos in the Protohistoric Period. So Magdalena, what do archaeologists mean by this term protohistoric period?
So, protohistoric period in archaeology refers to the transition between the prehistory and historic period, the times when the society starts to record their own written accounts. During this period, they are often documented in the text of their other neighboring literate society. In case of the Southwest, it means historical Spanish records.
Excellent. And so we're really looking at the time frame in your article with the 15th and 16th centuries. So 1400s, 1500s, a huge time of cultural transformation across the Great Plains. You're focused in like the Western Hemisphere, which we haven't really talked about this podcast with Southwest Plains Interaction. So it's awesome to have you on here because I'm looking at cultural transformations in the eastern part of the plains. So I love this topic. So who were these major populations living in the Southern Plains in the Rio Grande regions during this time period?
For the Rio Grande Valley, it was the agricultural Pueblo people, while the Southern Plains were inhabited by the specialized bison hunters during this period of time. So we are talking mostly about the Tierra Blanca complex and Garza complex that appeared around the middle of the 15th century in the Southern Plains, mainly the Texas Panhandle.
Excellent. Yeah. So who's living in the Rio Grande during this time period?
Different Pueblo societies connected by the Pueblo culture, like Pecos Pueblo, Galisteo Basin Pueblos, and so on, speaking different languages but sharing the same cultural pattern, mainly called Eastern Pueblo.
Got you. And like those are two very big, different groups, right? You're looking at these nomadic bison hunters who are leaving like a very ephemeral evidence on the plains. And like the Pueblos during this time are what we think about Pueblos being. Like they're making these large masonry room structures when people think Pueblos. So like very different archaeological records that are absolutely culturally distinct. So what was happening in the Southern Plains after AD 1450?
Oh, well, during this period, we can see in the archaeological records that earlier inhabitants of this region, semi-sedentary horticultural societies known as the plain villagers, were either displaced by specialized bison hunters or they have shifted their subsistence patterns to rely more upon bison hunting.
Okay, excellent. And so how did climate change or population movements and the decline of earlier plains village communities reshape this region, right? So we're talking about like Western Texas, Eastern New Mexico.
Also, at the end of the plains villagers period, we have clear evidence of conflict. Dismembered human remains, skulls as war trophies, bones bearing marks of healed wounds. The location of the settlements also shifted. They became smaller and moved to more defensive places. All this might have been connected to the transition from the humid Neo-Atlantic period to the cool and dry Pacific period. This shift led to the landscape turning into steppes, especially in the southern plains. Paleoenvironmental reconstruction even refers to it as degradation. This might have resulted in a fight for resources such as water. Well, another factor that might have contributed to it was the bison return to the Great Plains, and alongside it, migration of the hunter-gatherers, mainly southern Atapascan, that spread onto the Great Plains during this period.
Okay, excellent. So who or what were the Garza and Terra Blanca complexes, and why are they so important to the story and to this article?
They were the two complexes that appeared in the middle of the 15th century on the Texas Panhandle. They were characterized by residential and hunting camps on which we find tipi rings. But what is really important is that on their sides we can observe a sharp increase of the southwestern artifacts, which suggests that the trade started to flourish alongside with their appearance. Some people even tried to tie Tierra Blanca complex to the southern Atapascans, although we have to be careful when making such statements.
Fair enough. And so to like start painting a geographic picture, the Tierra Blanca complex is situated around Amarillo, Texas. And to the south is where we find the Garza complex, which is situated around Lubbock, Texas. And so one aspect of this is not just conflict, which you brought up, but also trade. And so what evidence did you find that suggests that trade intensified between the Southern Plains and the Rio Grande Pueblos during this period?
Well, the main evidence is a sharp increase in amount of particular artifacts, pottery, bison bones in both regions, mainly eastern part of the Southwest and Texas Panhandle, especially when we compare it to an earlier prehistoric period when those items were found on both sides of the Llano Estacado, but they were not as abundant.
Excellent. Do you see evidence of turquoise or obsidian cliff obsidian from New Mexico appearing in these Western Plains complexes at all?
Yes, actually, we have some obsidian from the Jemez Mountain as well as turquoise. Another interesting item that is also quite telling are the shells from the Gulf of California. So they had to travel via the Southwest region to reach the people on the Southern Plains.
That's fascinating. So you're saying like even a more, cross-regional trade connection, and the Pueblos are acting as intermediaries in some way, shape, or form with groups in 15th, 16th century California, huh?
Yeah, they actually might have been like a gift alongside the trade to establish more concrete trade relationships.
Excellent. That is fascinating. So other than the obsidian, the shells, some turquoise, are there any other goods that you can recall that were also being moved around even from the Southwest or beyond? Is there anything coming, I guess, anything coming further east, like are these plains groups, the Tierra Blanca and the Garza complexes, are they acting as intermediaries in any way, shape, or form for more eastern complexes?
While we have some items from the eastern parts appearing on their sites, I don't think they're actually reaching the southwest. So they are more intermediaries for the southwest items to appear on the Great Plains rather than on the opposite side.
Fair enough. So these complexes in the Western Plains described as nomadic bison hunting specialists, which many people who think of Plains Indians in Texas, like the Comanche, that's what they think of. And so one of your main arguments is that bison hides may have been among the most important trade commodities exchanged. Is that correct? And how do you see these bison hides being exchanged when bison hides themselves do not last in the archaeological record because they're organic material, right?
Yeah, that's true. So the first point I started with my studies was the fact that some works already proved that food products were not as important, right, for those communities when it comes to exchange. Yet they retain a stable, regular, yearly trading relationship throughout the years. And I was wondering about how and why did they do that? So when I started to look into the historical sources from a little bit later period, Spanish historical sources, all of them, when they mentioned trade, they mentioned bison hides. And they even noted how important it was for the Pueblo. The more archaeological evidence for it to become more popular is the fact that we find on some of the eastern Pueblo sites, we found specific stone tools for preparing the bison hides to be used. So that's also interesting. It's the bison hides shields. So we can see it on the rock art, actually, that the earlier rectangular, larger shields are replaced by smaller round shields made probably from the backskin of bison hides. Some of them are even from the historical period. And also, so that's part of it, because the bison hides were more durable. And the other thing is that you can make more warmer clothes from it, right? And as I already said, and we already discussed it, the period we're speaking about was much colder, so the temperatures were much harsher. We even know that winters, those harsh winters, slowed the Spanish entrance to the southwest. They were blocked, they had to go back and then return a year later. So it was probably part of why the bison hides became popular in the southwest, one of the reasons.
Excellent. And so these Southern Athabascan speakers, these ancestral Apache groups, Dene groups, who do we believe currently, or who do the tribes themselves state are representative of these groups?
Well, we do believe, due to mostly language similarities, that they are the ancestors of the both Apache groups and the Navajo. But it is worth mentioning that the Navajo believe they emerge in the Dinetah, which is in the southwest. And knowing the culture, which have both elements of the southwest and the hunter-gatherer tribes coming from the north, it's actually important to underscore the belief they held about their origins.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, we see in the Central Plains, we can see these ancestral Athabascans coming in, what we call Dismal River. But that's It's around the same time, around the 1400s, and 1500s, Dismal River coming in through Wyoming and coming down the western part of Kansas, Nebraska, eastern Colorado. So it's interesting seeing that continual line of migration down into Texas, where these folks, as you're showing, are creating new trade systems and also developing a different archaeological record, as opposed to the Plains Village societies that had existed in that region beforehand. So you mentioned, Great Bend aspect, Antelope Creek, ancestral Wichita and Caddos had originally been there with little evidence of trade for the Southwest. And all of a sudden you have these new people arriving, really staking a very different form of life in that region and being more connected with the Southwest, and clearly California, and I imagine Mexico as well.
It's actually interesting because Southwest had connections to the Mexican sides, especially the Casa Grande side, but those trade routes decline around the same period as the bison hunters appear in the Southern Plains, which may also lead why those new trading routes were established by the Southwestern people.
Excellent. Fascinating stuff. And we'll be right back with episode 47 after these messages. And we're back. So kicking off this second segment, we're really going to be exploring the complex social and political relationships that developed alongside the economic exchange. And just starting us off, how do archaeologists identify trading relationships through pottery and other material culture, right? Like we've kind of talked about, we're seeing things exchanged, but how much of something has to cross these cultural boundaries for it to be labeled as trade and not necessarily some guy walking from Texas into New Mexico and emptying their pockets on the side of the road?
Well, the amount is really important. So before the middle of 15th century, you have some shards of pottery, which could consist of like one vessel. But after this period, the period I'm talking about in my article, those shards can be counted in hundreds, and they appear on almost like plenty of sites of those two complexes from the south, from the southern plains on the Texas Panhandle. And they not only appear on the campsites, but also on the hunting grounds. So we can see that they use the pottery they acquired on a much broader scale than before, right? And also what we already were talking about, turquoise obsidian, which is more connected to probably the gifts. They didn't appear before, and now they are appearing also on plenty of sites, which may mean that all of those people were having a trade relationship with some of the Pueblo groups in the southwest. And as for the southwest, so we find a sharp increase, like also to the hundreds of the bison bones. There is a speculation that some of them may be hunted by the Pueblo themselves, but we already spoke about new stone tools that appeared during this period. We know from the historical sources that they traded yearly, so it's also a great help for us to understand those relationships, right? Which is another interesting topic.
Absolutely. And so why might have trade in particular have encouraged the development of broader political alliances in the region? Like do we know if the Pueblos themselves were all a united front, or there's also factionalization between them? Do we see different complexes in the Western Plains interacting with certain Pueblos while not interacting with each other? Like, what is going on diplomatically in this area?
That's an interesting topic, because when it comes to archaeological evidence, we don't see much about the conflicts or their own opinions about each other. But when we look to the later historical sources, which are a great help, in my opinion, to understand the situation, we can see that the opinions from the Spaniards varies about different groups and different contacts they have with each other. They also, for example, report about an attack on one of the Pueblo group did by the Navajo alongside with some different Pueblo people. So it's interesting. Also, the first thing the Spaniards noted from the southern plains were that there are two groups, Querechos and Teyas, and they actually are enemies of each other, and they fight against each other, which was another interesting point to study. So when it comes to specific relationships that we can notice via the archaeological findings, the interesting study was made by Leonard, and it's a chapter of a book from 2006, which proved that the pottery found on the Tierra Blanca complex sites mostly come from the part of the Rio Grande Valley, from the Galisteo Basin, which had trading centers trading with the southern plains, but were not the only trading centers. So we have, for example, Pecos Pueblo also, but apparently most of the pottery shards were from those sites were found on those complex.
Yeah. And so something that you did mention, that seeing conflict as well. So if trade was so important, why also do we see evidence of conflict between these groups?
Well, it should be noted that while we are talking about, for example, the Pueblo people who share the same culture, they were in fact organized in several larger settlements that could have rivaled each other for resources, power, and the monopoly in the trade. We saw a situation like that, for example, in ancient Greece, right? So they were not a monolith, and the same can be said about the Great Plains societies, right? So they were separate communities, settlements, sites, and even bands with their own connections and agendas. Attacks could be launched against trading partners of the rival groups, or even against neutral Pueblos not involved in a trade with the attackers.
Excellent. I think that's a great analogy to point out, is like thinking about pueblos as theater states or city states in that own regard. Like they might share a holistic culture that they all somewhat abide by, but different population centers run by different folks with different, who have agency themselves and maybe not see themselves as part of like a broader Puebloan nation, but more heavily focused responsibility to their individual Pueblo themselves. So that's excellent. I really like how you brought that analogy up. So what archaeological and historical evidence do we see either suggests or illustrates tensions existed both within and between Plains and Pueblo communities in the 15th and 16th century?
Interestingly enough, we do not have many archaeological evidences of the conflict, but historical sources and oral traditions paint an interesting picture. We know that on the southern plains, as I already said earlier, there were at least two groups who were enemies, the Querechos and Teyas. And on one of the Garza complex site, we found a circular embankments. Similar defense structures were found on several sites from the other southern plains communities, and in historical period they were known from the Wichita villages. As for the Pueblo communities, the testament to the conflict can be a Galisteo Basin ruins, located in the basin which hosted important trade centers, yet all of those sites were abandoned at the end of the 17th century. Early Spanish sources noted the accounts of the encountered Pueblo people that said that these settlements were destroyed by the plain hunters. And we know about some smaller attacks and raids from the later period also from the historical sources.
Right, because people don't need to build like earthen embankments or palisade walls to keep out bison, right? Like defensive fortifications are generally because of other people, and you only do that when you're afraid of being attacked. So like just the structural evidence is pretty critical here. Is there any thought, or like, maybe not thought's the right term, but like thinking about even looking at contemporary international happenings at the moment, like how can trade partners also become rivals or enemies, in your opinion or your archaeological background?
I think when it comes to the Southwest, we need to account the Spanish colonization. That was an important factor that destabilized the existing situation. On the one hand, they brought new goods that became more appealing in trade. On the other, they also introduces slave trade, which became on a much broader scale, which quickly became quite profitable for some of the groups living in this region. Also on the land they've conquered, the Spaniards often abolished yearly trade as they were afraid that it might lead to a revolt or scheming behind their backs. So they also attacked groups that were coming to the Pueblos for trade. Often, like, they did it despite like the crown themselves or despite the local governments. They just did it for those slave trade I mentioned, which is also unfortunately part of the tragic history of this region. So some of these Pueblo might have actually been seen as an accomplice to the Spaniards, not real accomplice, but the grief was growing, and if you want to like let it go, you look for people you associate with those grievances, right? And probably the trade became also less and less profitable to some of the bands. And with the arrival of the horse in the Southwest, it was much easier and maybe safe to raid for the goods rather than trade and risk Spanish coming and snapping you in the middle of those events. So there are a lot of things that happened with the colonization and with the Europeans arriving. I believe we should also take into consideration when we speak about those relationships, because we know that in later period they were enemies, especially Navajo. But there was a lot of happening and going on before that, right?
Absolutely. So as we're winding down this podcast and this episode, which has been fantastic, so what is like the key point or argument about the relationships between the Southern Plains and the Rio Grande Pueblos that you really want your readers to get out of your article?
I do believe the first thing is that we should interpret those groups not as monoliths and like a simple conflict between sedentary agriculturalists and nomadic hunter-gatherers, which is a quite popular opposition even outside of the North American archaeology. They were their own separate groups with their own agendas, and we can see that they were trading with different groups from both plains and the Southwest, which might have led to some alliances appearing between those groups. And we should also look to the historical sources to see how the situation in the Southwest were portrayed as a complicated one with all those different relationships between those groups, right? Yeah, so just a rivalry between those groups should be interpreted as conflict more between particular settlements and bands instead of like a hunter-gatherers rivalry between them and agriculturalists.
Sounds good. Well, this has been fantastic. I'm really happy that we were able to schedule you on the podcast, you being in Poland and then me being in Kansas, able to get this down.
Yeah, we were able
This has been great. And so as this is a continuation of this ongoing series of promoting and highlighting recent articles in Plains Anthropologist, the full citation of Magdalena's article is in the episode description, as well as a link to Plains Anthropologist. And if you have membership already, you have access to the full catalog of the journal. If not, it will bring you to a page where you can sign up to become a member, and then you immediately have access to the journal itself. So Magdalena, it has been so fun having you on the podcast. And with that, we are out. Thank you for listening to the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. You can follow me on Instagram at Pawnee_archaeologist, and you can also email me at greatplainsarchpodcast@gmail.com. And remember, anybody can love the mountains, but it takes a soul to love the prairie. American author Willa Cather.
Thanks for listening to this podcast. The Archaeology Podcast Network's chief editor is Rachel Roden. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy. Our social media and newsletter coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht. The APN was founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle on December 1st, 2014. We're supported by our amazing podcast hosts, many volunteers, and listeners like you. Check out membership at www.archpodnet.com/members.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.